from the Mutual Broadcasting System. This is STRAT, Strategic Risk Assessment Talk. Now, retired Marine Intelligence Officer and globally recognized risk expert Hal Kempfer.
Welcome to STRAT, Strategic Risk Assessment Talk, and today I'm going to discuss something that is around what I've discussed before. Obviously, the huge crisis with the Strait of Hormuz, the Persian Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz being that critical waterway that's being blocked by Iran because of the war. And I'm going to talk about the global supply chain meltdown outside of oil. We get a lot of stuff on oil in the news. I've talked a lot of stuff about oil, but I'm going to talk about some of the other things that are being affected and where those effects are being felt throughout the world in terms of our global supply chain. And it is probably much bigger than you think. Now, a little background here. Among other things that I've done for many years is working with foreign Coast Guard, Navy, Maritime officers, officials all around the world on behalf of the U.S. government, working on issues of maritime security and maritime domain awareness. All right, this is to build their institutional capacity, their institutional capability to do things and to be better stewards, if you want to use that term, of the oceans, of the waterways, looking at a variety of things, not just certainly things like war, like what we see here, but looking at things like fisheries, pollution, a variety of other threats that they face in the maritime domain. So that's one of the things that I've been doing. Part of this, too, is we look at trade, and we look at how critical trade is and how important the maritime domain is to a country's economy. So when you look at trade worldwide, you're going to look at some key maritime choke points. And those choke points around the globe have really kind of come into focus because two of them have been shut down because one by Iran directly and the other was because of an Iranian proxy group shut down another one. Let's talk about the proxy group. That was the Houthis in Yemen, and they were doing anti-ship operations, and that was causing problems in and around the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, which is what connects the Gulf of Aden, but really connects the Indian Ocean to the Red Sea. And if you're shipping stuff through the Suez Canal globally, you're going to go through the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. And so obviously that had a huge impact. And overall, that was about 5% of global commerce was going through that area. And so that little group that was sitting up there in those mountains in Yemen was causing major disruption. The other that we're dealing with now is the Strait of Hormuz. This is not a new threat. Iran has threatened to do stuff in the Strait of Hormuz for decades. They actually did kind of shut it down for a bit, sort of, maybe a little bit in the 80s, and the U.S. response was to flag foreign tankers with U.S. flags, and we would do U.S. Navy escorts going through the Strait of Hormuz and into the Persian Gulf. So this is not a new thing, but what is happening here, shutting down all this, is having dramatic impact across the world in terms of global supply chains for oil, but also in other commodities, and I'm going to talk about some of those other commodities this morning, all right? It's critical for global supplies of oil, but it's also critical for natural gas, and how that gets shipped around the world is liquefied natural gas, and that is something that the Persian Gulf, specifically a couple of countries, have become absolutely indispensable for the global economy. And it's also become, because of what it produces, these are also critical components to fertilizer. So it's very, very important for global agriculture as well, and that ties to food supplies and potential food shortages. And interestingly, because of the natural gas, one of the byproducts comes out as helium. So it has become a major source of helium, which has also moved into the supply chain as something vitally needed in high technology. And I'll talk more about that in a bit. Now, Israel attacked the Iran's South Pars gas field. That's one of the biggest gas fields And that changed things. In fact, that was so dramatic that the President of the United States actually turned to Israel and said, don't do that again, because what that did was it opened up gas infrastructure, which had already kind of a little bit been targeted by Iran. But by hitting that gas field in that way, Iran suddenly turned around and started attacking gas and oil infrastructure throughout the Gulf. And this has had some really big effects and major damage. Natural gas was hit, the infrastructure for it was hit in Qatar. And I should mention that Qatar accounts for about 20% of the global liquefied natural gas supply. So late last week, Qatar Energy declared what's called a force majeure on deliveries after these Iranian drone and missile strikes on the big Ras Laffan industrial city that is basically the world's largest LNG export hub. Now, force majeure, for those who don't know, is where the cause is from a superior or irresistible force, right? In other words, you're saying an event or an effect that cannot be reasonably anticipated or controlled. It's a core concept in business risk and related contracts to business risk. And it sounds something, we sometimes hear the term act of God used for disasters in the United States when they talk about it was unanticipated, black swans, we couldn't see it coming, that sort of thing. Well, that's kind of akin to that, not exactly, but that's a term that if you were looking into the force majeure terminology, you go, oh, okay, I kind of get where that comes from. Well, anyway, that's what Qatar has basically said. They're the world's third largest natural gas exporter. So the strike is a big hit on the global supply of natural gas. And this is gas, liquefied natural gas, that would otherwise be flowing to places like Italy, Belgium, South Korea, China, elsewhere around the world. So there's going to be big effects in those places, not just price shocks, but also supply shocks. It's interesting, Jim Crane, who is a fellow of Middle Eastern Studies at Rice University's Baker Institute, said we're now seeing direct attacks on multi-billion-dollar infrastructure that's going to take as long as 5 years to fix. I want to kind of underline that, 5 years to fix. It's keeping a significant portion of the world's LNG supplies off the market for a very long time, and it's going to be very costly. So this is not an insignificant thing. Whereas we seem to put a lot of focus on oil, and oil coming out of the Persian Gulf is huge. This liquefied natural gas thing is really big, and because of some of the very costly and difficult to replace components of that liquefied natural gas production line, if you will, that it's going to take a long time to get this stuff back up to where it was. So we're going to feel this for quite a while. This isn't going away. Even as the Gulf gets opened up, we might get oil flowing out there faster, but it's going to take a while to get this LNG complex put back together again because of what just happened. Basically the war has effectively choked off this critical passage for not only oil, but also the chemicals that make up a lot of other things, not just natural gas, but also something related, the fertilizer market. A third of all fertilizer shipped globally goes through the Strait of Hormuz. A lot of people don't realize that. In the agricultural sector worldwide, there is a realization of this. But a lot of that fertilizer, a lot of the chemicals for fertilizer, and goes through the Strait of Hormuz, and now that's all been blocked as well. So this is having an impact in a lot of areas. Obviously, oil prices going up, natural gas prices spiking, but fertilizer prices have also been spiking as well. Fertilizer prices are going way up. They're about 30% higher in many parts of the world, and that's pretty significant. And that's something that came from the Carnegie Endowment for the International Peace. There's an expert there, Noah Gordon, who's been speaking about that. Countries like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and Iran are all big producers of fertilizer. And they export the raw ingredients to other countries to make fertilizers. And those ingredients are things like natural gas and some other minerals. So basically, we have a shortage of fertilizer that could ripple across the worldwide economy. It's going to raise eventually. Fertilizer is tied to the production of food, so you're going to see an increase in food prices. Yes, you will see inflation as well, because food is pretty much a staple within how we do inflation. We calculate inflation, but So you're going to have a real problem. The other problem is this is spiking just before planting season. It's March. So around the world is planting season for a lot of farmers. And so this is scrambling their decision on, well, what am I going to do? How am I going to do this? Where am I going to get my fertilizer from? Where am I going to buy the fertilizer from? How much am I going to have to pay? And you got to remember, farmers' margins in terms of the ag sector, their margins have been basically eaten away for many, many years. So now you're throwing another price shock into that supply chain, along with some extreme weather that they've been dealing with. And now you're seeing, pardon the expression, a perfect storm for the ag market because this fertilizer thing. Now they're, opening the strait to allow fertilizer to flow is probably a pretty tall order to make happen. And certainly it's going to be pretty tough for this administration to make that happen. Despite efforts to free all these trapped ships and stuff, I don't know if they're going to raise fertilizer to stop, but there is a risk for global farmers. There's a risk for U.S. farmers and food consumers as these things continue to rise. Without strategically prioritizing the delivery of critical farm inputs such as urea, ammonia, nitrogen, phosphorus, and various sulfur-based products, the U.S. risks a shortfall in crop production. And that's something that's come from the American Farm Bureau. And as someone who grew up as a farmer, that is something kind of near and dear to my heart. All right. It's a threat to our food security. And if you look at that, it's a threat to our national security. And it could contribute to inflationary pressure here in the United States as well. So this isn't something that's just affecting Asia. This isn't something that just affects Europe. And a lot of times you hear this like, well, we don't import all that oil and stuff. No, but when you get into the fertilizer market, that is something that does affect us in a major way. And you got to remember, this is only 4 years after the fertilizer market took a huge hit when Russia invaded Ukraine. Remember, one of the things that came out of the Black Sea area was fertilizer. That was a huge export. So back then, the market readjusted, absorbed the price shock, absorbed the supply shock, and guess where they landed? They kind of landed by increasing imports from the Middle East, increasing imports and reliance on the source of fertilizer that is now being blocked by the Strait of Hormuz, being blocked by Iran because of this war. So you're really seeing kind of an unparalleled global fertilizer crisis that comes out of the Strait of Hormuz. And that's something that is not making headlines. It's going to get more important over time, but it is a huge, huge issue. Also, okay, and you're saying, oh my gosh, this is really starting to balloon. Well, speaking of balloons, it's also knocked out about a third of the world's helium supplies. And you're saying, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? You mean we're going to have a shortage of helium balloons? No. This is actually a critical component in the semiconductor industry. And that has become helium gas's single largest customer. And they don't really have a viable substitute for this. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz has cut off helium shipments from Qatar. And Qatar is the world's largest helium deposit, and that is something that comes as a byproduct of all the natural gas extraction that they do. It's something that they have, they didn't used to really pay a lot of attention. Now they do. They basically have turned this into an entire industry. It's very well developed. It's very, very, very exacting industry and stuff. And Qatar produces about 63 million cubic meters of helium in 2025. Out of the 190 million cubic meters produced globally. So you get an idea of how big that is. Now, if the condition persists, the market is essentially going to start missing about 5.2 million cubic meters of helium per month. And that's quite a bit. That's roughly, and we're starting to see indicators of this shortage because we're starting to see about 50% spot price increases. If the disruption, stays sustained for a while, for a period of time, we could see some price shocks going up to $2,000 per 1,000 cubic feet. That's a lot. And chip makers face a huge risk. There really is no substitute for helium. And now it's really being used more for chip fabrication. It used to be something we saw a lot in MRIs. still big in MRIs, but it's something that we really see in chip fabrication. And cheaper gases like argon and nitrogen just don't deliver the same performance parameters that manufacturers, that semiconductor industry gets from helium. So they want to stick with helium. They don't want to go back to these other gases because they just don't do what they need to do. So this is a big problem. They require it to meet extremely tight cleanliness standards, and that's not something they can easily meet by switching suppliers either. What they've created in Qatar gives them exactly what they want. What was damaged in Qatar is something that's going to take a while to fix. And the other thing is, because of the availability of helium, it's not that closed loop helium systems don't exist, but they don't exist. They're not been widely adopted by chip makers. So, helium's been so cheap that a lot of these chip makers, they've designed their plants that they basically vent the helium after use because, frankly, it's just not that expensive. It's not really cost effective to retain it. Some do, but most don't. And so you're talking about these chip manufacturers around the world would have to do some construction, some major work, some fabrication in order to create closed loop systems for helium that they currently don't have. That too would take time to put into effect. Now, ironically, over time, if helium is less available from the Persian Gulf, less available from Qatar, that may help alternate sources of helium, such as North America, may benefit, at some point from this crisis. But again, it takes a long time to put helium production into effect. It's not something you just snap your fingers and you're producing helium and shipping helium around the world. So it's like, yes, there may be some downstream benefit for North America in the area of helium, but in the short term, you've got this massive disruption, this massive price shock in the helium market, which is going to translate to semiconductors, which translates to everything in high tech. You've got this fertilizer price shock, which ties to everything dealing with fertilizer, which goes into food, which could potentially result in a food crisis down the line in various parts of the world, and not to mention just lots of increases in food prices overall, which would increase inflation, which is going to be very, very tough, certainly because 2026 in the United States is a midterm election year, and a lot of inflation in a midterm election year usually does not translate well in polls for the party in power. So just got to point that out. All right. Anyway, a lot to consider there, a lot to think about. So just putting that out there. There's a lot more than oil that goes through the Strait of Hormuz. Thanks for listening to STRAT. Also, please visit stratpodcast.com. You can go to my YouTube channel, Hal Kempfer TV, and it's www.GRIPSA is my corporate website, so you can also go there. And if you go to the Los Angeles, InfraGardLosAngeles.org website, they are playing for a period of time the encore version of the nationwide webinar I did last week on global threat update. So, please avail yourselves of that if you're interested. Although I'll be the first to say things change fast. So what we recorded last Wednesday, a lot of things have happened since last Wednesday, but it'll give you a good idea of what's happening around the world. Anyway, thanks again, and have a great week.